All right. Well, thank you all for coming to this webinar. Welcome. Today we are joined by Matt Siefert, who is the watershed coordinator for Tinkers Creek Watershed Partners. And I should introduce myself first. I'm Dr. Erica Matheny, the executive director for Tinkers Creek Watershed Partners. We're all really excited to hear about Matt and his birding experience. He brings a wealth of experience to Tinkers Creek about from both public and private sectors. He has expertise in lake management, some environmental education experience as a park naturalist, and has also worked with invasive fish management. So here at Tinkers Creek, Matt helps to support our technical services with stormwater compliance, and he has been working hard to help manage our educational programming for the communities in our watershed, along with our Now Core members, both of who are on this webinar. So thank you to both of you as well. Matt holds a degree in biology, a master's from Shippensburg University in Pennsylvania, and a bachelor's degree in environmental biology from Pennsylvania West University, Clarion. He has a passion for nature that goes just beyond the professional at work. He's an avid birder and wildlife photographer, and in his own words, is a dedicated ranter on the topic of non-native species. So we're thrilled to have Matt here to share his insights and expertise about native birds here with us today. So take it away, Matt.
All right. Thank you, Erica. And my screen is shared already, correct?
Mhm.
Excellent. All right. Yeah. So my name's Matt. Very big into birding. Very excited to have the opportunity to give this talk today. Um, the goal is to cover some of the basics of birding in the sense of like sort of what to look for when you're attempting to perform an ID in the field. We're going to go over some of the pros and cons of birding in the winter as opposed to other seasons. And we're going to talk about a few groups of birds and species in particular that you can find in northeastern Ohio during this time of the year, and just some interesting facts about them and whatnot. So before we begin, big shout out Instagram account Branches Books Brooks and Boggs for providing quite a bit of the photography in this slideshow. Really solid Instagram page. I recommend checking them out if you get the chance. That's totally not me. So let's get into my background a bit into birding, why I kind of got this far into the hobby and what drew my interest. I started in 2018 during an undergrad ornithology course that I took, which was ironically one of my least favorite classes I've ever taken, but not because of the birds. And that sort of planted the seed as far as my interests. And then right after that, in the summer of 2018, I started an internship at the Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge, which is a hotspot in the state of Ohio for a lot of different migratory birds and whatnot. So I was there seeing some pretty rare species. That was at the time where black-necked stilts began popping up in that portion of Ohio. It's also the very eastern edge of the yellow-headed blackbird's range, so that's become a more common sighting. But at the time, I believe I was up there for one of the first sightings. So that sort of began to cement the idea. And then in grad school between 2019 and 2020, I really got into it. I started using an online service called eBird, which we'll talk a little bit about at the end, to find rarities. So some of the species I found during that time were the swallow-tailed kite up there at the top, uh, fairly common down along the coast of Florida and Georgia and things like that. You get one in PA every other year or so, so pretty big deal when one pops up. It took me about an hour of driving around farm fields to finally find it, but it was pretty amazing. And I don't have any good pictures of any of these ones that I'm about to talk about, so I had to um, find some others. The middle picture is called a Townsend solitaire. Arguably the rarest bird I've seen in the sense that its native range doesn't cross east of the Mississippi, and I found that in south central PA. So that was a really big find. And then blue grosbeaks, which do actually occur infrequently in northeastern Ohio. They're almost always a rarity. But I believe in southern portions of the state, they're at least uncommon, if not a fairly easy species to find. But Again, I've found those in both southern PA and northeastern Ohio, where they are far less common. So those were really cool sightings to go out and track down by myself. Uh, Starting in 2021, I began volunteering at a bird banding station over in northwestern Ohio with a master bander named Tom Bartlett. He actually is the master bander for all of the Lake Erie Islands. So he'll do things like songbird banding as well as saw-whet owls in the winter. Um, he's a really generous birder or bander as far as allowing the public to interact with his operations and things like that. So I go help him from time to time. I also, for work, both at a previous position with Mill Creek Metro Parks and here, I do on occasion lead guided birding hikes. So yeah, I'm very invested in birds. And real quick, just some pictures of some banding I've done in the past, just because I think it's interesting. The top left, me holding a blue jay, and that might even be 2017. Uh, Top middle is me with a white-throated sparrow, which we're going to talk about a lot today. Uh, Probably around 2019. Top right, American tree sparrow. Uh, Bottom left is me with an American redstart. And then finally, bottom right is me at the National Aviary in Pittsburgh. Uh, my wife bought me an owl encounter, they call it. So I got to briefly hold that little Eastern screech owl, and it was an amazing experience. So before we get into winter birding in general, wanted to just talk about some reasons why it's good to get into birding just as a hobby as a whole. The barrier to entry is low, whereas the ceiling is quite high. And what I mean by that is you really don't need a lot to start birding. You can just walk outside and listen or see things. Though, if somebody were to ask me where a good starting point, I would say the free Merlin app on your smartphone has information on every bird in North America. It can identify pictures that you take. It can listen to sounds in real time and ID them to a very high degree of accuracy. Um, and then I would usually recommend you could get away with a pretty cheap pair of binoculars, and those will take you pretty far. Though most people tend to upgrade, but even then, I mean, I've been rocking the same pair of Vortex Diamondback binoculars for like 7 years. Um, and those are by no means very expensive compared to the top end binoculars. So you really don't need a lot to start, but you can significantly invest in the hobby if you so choose to really enhance your degree of either seeing or photography, things like that. Um, Birds are also everywhere. It's pretty hard to go outside and not at least have one species of bird around you. I mean, the Walmart parking lot has gulls in it. So, I mean, like I said, you'd have to be in a pretty rough spot to not have at least something around you. Uh, According to the Ohio Ornithological Society, Ohio's total count since people started paying attention to this is 450 species that have ever occurred in the state. That's including your extinct species like the passenger pigeon, uh, non-native species that have been released like starlings or like um, house sparrows, things like that. And then even just like one-ofs. I know, I believe it's 2 years ago now in the fall, there's a species called a ruff that typically occurs in the UK or parts of Europe that popped up here for some reason that somebody found actually in Portage County. Um, that makes the list. So that 450 is a little high as far as like things you could realistically expect to find, but we do have approximately 190 species that will breed annually in Ohio. As far as species that even just pass through and migrate that don't necessarily nest in the state, that bumps up to like the high 200s. So you can find a lot just in Ohio. And for me personally, why I really enjoy it is I consider it a really good brain off activity. What I mean by that is, you don't need to be looking at a screen or anything to go birding. For me, I find it to be a very cathartic experience and very relaxing experience. So I consider that a big pro of the hobby. When I need to decompress, I like to take a walk with the camera and go look and see what I can find. So before we get into winter birding, I think it's important to preface what goes on in the fall. because that will usually set the stage for what we see in the winter. So our fall migration and birding in general is usually your highlights include um, fall and spring migration, because that's when a lot of stuff that you only get to see for a short window of time pop up in various areas. Ohio's on a major migratory flyway. The I'm going to say we're on the Mississippi flyway, but I might be misremembering that. Um, so we get a ton of really cool migrants that pass through 2 times a year. And it happens in very notable waves, particularly in the fall. So from around July and August, you'll see your swallows start heading south, and then quite a few shorebirds will pop up. Like the one in the top right, that's a shorebird called a sanderling. That's an immature. So that one, what he was born that the year that picture was taken. Um, Around September, October, you get your songbirds, what I call songbirds galore, because you have your migratory warblers coming through, the thrushes. This bottom right picture is a ruby-crowned kinglet. They pop up in very large numbers in the fall. And then November, December, right now we are in waterfowl season, which is one of my favorite times. You get a lot of our winter ducks are popping up. That's a common loon down in the bottom left, and they'll pop up throughout the year, but typically it's spring and fall that you're going to see, or you'll have the best chance of seeing them, um, particularly in larger lakes and things like that. So now winter birding. Uh, do a little pros and cons list. So advantages why winter is a great time to go out birding. You have minimal leaf cover. So obviously in the spring and summer when the trees are full, if something's hanging out in the canopy, it can be a lot harder to find it in the scope or with a camera. So when the leaves fall, it's a lot easier to follow something as it moves through the trees. You have few, if any, nuisance insects active. So a lot of the times wetlands tend to be pretty great spots to go birding, but not the most fun experience in the summer when the mosquitoes and whatnot are out. So in the winter, you don't really have to worry about insects messing with you. It's relatively quiet out in the wintertime, partially because the insects are gone for this season. So it's easier to find things by sound. This is particularly true of anything that forages along the ground, um, like your sparrows and whatnot that are actively picking through the leaf litter. So you can actually hear the crunching leaves of something moving around. Though oftentimes that's just going to lead you to a squirrel, but still you can usually identify something moving along the ground a bit more easily in the winter. And ice can cause waterfowl to congregate in very small spots. Through in that little note, remember when lakes used to freeze? Because that's becoming a bit less of a common occurrence in this area. But if you do get a good freeze, particularly causeways on larger lakes, the one that comes to mind for me is the causeway along Mosquito Lake State Park up in Cortland, Ohio. You'll usually get a pocket of standing water where a lot of your winter ducks will congregate in one little spot, and you can see a ton of stuff with pretty minimal effort. So ice can very much be your friend in the wintertime if you're looking for ducks. Some disadvantages for winter birding. Lower temperatures, of course, are harder to recreate in. It's cold, so you have to bundle up more often. I mean, there are days where you could have great shooting conditions as a photographer, but it's just 20 degrees out and I don't feel like going outside. Leaf litter and ice are allowed underfoot. So it's easier to give yourself away sometimes when you're trying to sneak up on something and be quiet. And in the winter, we do have fewer species present compared to either migration or the summer when things are out and breeding and whatnot. Uh, no encounter better encapsulates the pros and cons of winter birding quite like this Carolina wren I have posted here. I think this is probably the closest I've ever come to getting frostbite when I was taking pictures. It was probably like 25 degrees, and he just kept singing and letting me get closer and closer. So I really pushed it. My fingers were throbbing for like 20 minutes after I got back in the car, but I got some pretty cool shots of him. He did poop right before I got this really nice shots, and a little too close to crop it out properly. So that was unfortunate, but I still really like the picture. So we're going to get into a little bit on just the basics of identifying birds as a whole. Um, I do want to note that I am basing these four aspects that we're going to talk about off of a guide you can find on the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's website. If you go at Google like all about birds, bird ID skills, they have these four sections that are pretty commonly taught in various ways. But we're going to start with color. It's arguably one of the easiest ways to identify something you see. Uh, Now, it's not always the most reliable, but there are, as we're going to talk about right here, exceptions to where when you see these colors, I mean, you really can't mistake them with anything else. So over on the left there, and these also aren't really winter birds, but they drive the point home more. So on the left, we have the northern parula, which happens to be, I don't know if you can see it, it's on my hoodie. Completely unmistakable species when you see that yellow and blue and brown. I mean, there's nothing else that occurs, at least in Ohio, that you could mistake that with. Um, Top right, the black-throated blue warbler, that's a male. Again, you just don't see that color pattern on anything else as far as the black, white, and blue. And then probably something people are more familiar with, the Baltimore Oriole in the bottom right. That's a male. Um, at least, or I do want to point out for Orioles, the male Baltimore Oriole is the primary color that is really hard to confuse with anything else because you get that nice flame orange with the black head. Though the female Baltimore Oriole is more dull colored, they usually have more yellow than like that bright orange. We also have another Oriole called the Orchard Oriole, whereas the male pretty easy to tell apart because they have more dull, like a burnt orange plumage, but the females once again look fairly similar because they get that sort of duller yellow. But the male is the one that you really, I mean, you see that there's nothing else it could be. But color can be applied in other ways too. Um, Even for our less vibrant species, this is where you start to look into more of like the details of the color. So sparrows, uh, pretty common. We in Ohio get over a dozen different species regularly, but they tend to be one of the trickier groups to distinguish between different species. There's tends not to be a lot of color, though we will talk about more sparrows later on. But here's two examples. A big thing with sparrow ID is you want to get a look at the breast because that's where they tend to vary more. So on the left, we have a song sparrow, arguably the most common sparrow in Ohio, and you see that really dark streaking, kind of messy streaking along the breast. Whereas with the American tree sparrow on the right, which is only in Ohio during the winter, you have a very clean breast with the single black spot. And that's usually your dead giveaway that you have an American tree sparrow in front of you. Though there's other things too, as far as like you have more gray on the side of the head, um, that bicolored bill. So the top mandible, I don't know if it's actually called a mandible on birds. The top part of the beak is black, the bottom is yellow. So there's other features too, but that you can still look at something where they have generally the same color palette with those browns, grays, and whites, but it's sort of how they're displayed that can help you differentiate species pretty easily. Um, the sexes of birds can display different plumages. So we have quite a few species in Ohio that are what we call sexually dimorphic, where the male and the female do not look the same or have at least some variation in their color patterns. On the right, it's a pretty classic example, the red-winged blackbird. The male is actually black as opposed to the female, which can honestly be confused for a sparrow for more novice birders. That's they still have enough of a unique pattern that once you start to recognize it more easily, they don't look like a sparrow as much anymore, especially with that pointed bill. But you can see there can be vast color changes at least, so you might know what species you're looking at, but you can use color to even go so far as to tell if it's a male or a female. On the left there, we have a red-bellied woodpecker, very common Ohio bird. That is a female because in the male, you would expect that red to extend over the top of the head into the beak, whereas the female, it stops. She basically has like a red mullet. that won't go to the top. So moving from color to size and shape, that's another really great clue as to perform a field ID. These principles can be applied to both the bird itself as well as individual body parts. So one of the most classic examples of two species that are differentiated primarily by size and shape are the downy woodpecker on the bottom left, and then next to it is the hairy woodpecker. One of the easiest trip ups for novice and intermediate level birders because they do look extremely similar. The giveaways there being the hairy woodpecker is notably larger than the downy. The downy is smaller than a cardinal, whereas the hairy is roughly blue jay sized, maybe a bit smaller than a blue jay. The other thing you would look for is the downy's bill is significantly shorter, excuse me, relative to the size of the head, whereas the hairy's extends pretty far. Interestingly, those two are not close relatives at all. I mean, they're both still woodpeckers, but you would think that genetically they'd be very similar, but they really aren't. It's one running theory for those is that the downy woodpecker is potentially mimicking the hairy woodpecker, kind of like how viceroy butterflies mimic monarch butterflies. The thought behind that being not a lot of birds that would like visit a feeder per se or something along those lines, or just a general source of food, really want to mess with a hairy woodpecker because they're fairly aggressive and they're relatively large for the birds that would feed on the things that the hairy wants to feed on. Anybody that has bird feeders probably knows that their downies are borderline at the top of the food chain when it comes to bird feeders. They will bully pretty much anything else off of it. And they're starting to think part of how that works for such a small bird is that they are confusing other species into thinking they are a hairy woodpecker. That's for as far as I know, that hasn't been like confirmed or like the fully accepted idea, but it's an interesting thought at least. Another instance where I personally often look for size and shape is when I'm looking for kestrels. So the American kestrel is the smallest falcon, I believe, in North America. It's on the bottom right. Everybody knows, or a lot of people are familiar with, like the classic dove on a wire look. Driving down a country road, you see tons of doves sitting on the wires. But if you look closely and you start to learn the differences in body shape, you'll realize that occasionally you aren't driving by doves, you are driving by kestrels because they also quite like to sit on wires overhanging country roads. And as you start to realize, the more prominent skinny neck of the dove and that really sharp tail that sticks out, you can kind of get used to making snap IDs when you're driving, or should I say, riding in the passenger seat. You shouldn't be kestrel watching when you're driving, even though I don't follow that rule very well. But I don't condone attempting to look for kestrels while you operate your vehicle. But once you start to pick up on the differences in body shape, you'll realize that you drive by more kestrels than you would originally think, which is great because kestrels are really cool birds. And they're here in the winter. Behavior, another way to either assist with an ID or just do the ID solely off of behavior. I would say more often than not, you're going to use behavior to support an ID as opposed to just get an ID by itself, but it can really help you narrow down where you're at. So some examples, when you're looking at ducks, some of our ducks are divers where they'll actually go down to the bottom of the lake or the pond or whatever they're sitting on, and they'll look for food versus our dabbling ducks, which are like your classic, like the mallard, which will tip halfway over and stick their head down with their butt sticking up still in the air. Some species like to move along the tree bark, so woodpeckers. On the bottom right, we have a super common bird, the white-breasted nuthatch, which will also move along the bark, but they always go down. They go headfirst down the tree, as opposed to woodpeckers, which are going up the tree. So that behavior can give you an idea of what you're looking at from a distance. On the top right, we have a Caspian tern. They are gull-like, but the big thing with terns, which is part of why I like them so much, is if you've ever seen an osprey hunting on a lake or a pond where they'll sort of fly, they'll hover for a minute and then they dive bomb down. Terns do that exact same thing. They'll just be flying and then out of nowhere, it looks like they got shot. They just beeline down to the water, dive in like a torpedo, and then they'll come up with a fish. So usually, again, if you see something, that behavior, you are likely to be able to tell that you're probably looking at a tern. And then the bottom left are probably our most common flycatcher, the eastern phoebe. One of their key ID traits is that they like to flick their tail a lot when they're sitting. So they'll go land on a branch and you'll just see the tail going, flicking over and over again. And they're not the only bird that flicks their tail, but usually you can use that with the context clues as far as, I think I saw a flycatcher, I see it land, I see the tail flicking. Okay, it's probably a phoebe. So behavior can be a really great way to help with an ID. And then finally, habitat. That's another big thing. You can usually, if you're aware of what your or where you're birding as far as like your surroundings, what trees are present, how close to water are you, you can narrow down the list of what might be around you in your head before you even encounter anything. So, good examples would be on the left, we have a red-breasted nuthatch. Those are more commonly found in stands of conifers like pine, spruce, things like that, because they like to eat the seeds from the cones. Not saying you won't find them in a more deciduous forest or other habitats, but it's usually a safer bet if you're looking for one to go look for the conifers. In my experience, the same can be true with barred owls in the top right there. They tend to like to sit in stands of pine and whatnot. Another big thing, they usually nest fairly close to water. So in most of my encounters with barred owls in the wild, that's been true. You usually find them like the one in the top right, sitting in a conifer of some kind, pretty close to a pond or lake. That once again doesn't mean they're always going to be there in that exact habitat, but you increase your chances of one if you know sort of preferences. And the same with the bottom right, the indigo bunting, which is a summer nester in Ohio. They're not here right now, but they have very strong habitat preferences for like shrubby areas that are on the edge of a forest, usually with like one or two tall bushes or small trees where the male can go up to the top and sing to declare his territory. So usually like once you kind of figure out what an indigo bunting likes, it's you'll get out in the field and be like, there's probably one around. I can just tell by eyeballing this place, or this would be a good spot to look. So you can dissect those four categories a bit more too and get a bit more specific. But usually if you have at least two of the four, it's pretty easy to narrow down what you've looked at if you have, say, a mystery bird that you weren't able to identify at the time you saw it. But using all four of them in conjunction can usually really make your life easier as far as figuring out what you saw. A commonly used phrase when you are looking at birds and trying to get an ID is a field mark, which is basically a visible feature that you use to identify and differentiate different species. If you look at a field guide or anything like that, they'll usually give you a list of things to look for based on different species. There's some, like we talked about earlier with the parula and the oriole and whatnot, where you get one field mark and there's just nothing else that looks like that, so you can ID it right away. Whereas there's other similar species, kind of like the sparrows we were talking about, where you usually want a list of like 3 to 4 field marks before you can make a confident ID until you just know them right off the bat. So, for example, let's say somebody comes up to you and says, "Oh, I saw a duck with a green head." That's the only field mark they have. Now, I'm sure most of us, when you hear, "Oh, duck with a green head," you're probably thinking of a northern shoveler, like me. But what if they didn't see a northern shoveler? What if they actually saw an American widgeon, or a mallard, or a common goldeneye, or a common merganser, or a greater scaup in the right lighting, or a green-winged teal, or a wood duck. Suddenly, green head isn't cutting it as far as getting the ID. But if we backtrack a little bit, these each do have unique field marks where if you were to give me 3 to 4, say I didn't see it, but you're explaining something to me or describing something to me, where I could make a better ID. So like, for example, the northern shoveler, they have that green head, you could say yellow eye, that chestnut coloration on the flank with white on the breast and belly. Usually with field marks, as far as how I looked into it with the proper definition of a field mark, you're looking at coloration of the plumage. Though in this case, like with the shoveler, you would also be able to point out like, oh, it also had an enormous bill, which is the dead giveaway for a shoveler. But technically, as far as my understanding goes, a field mark is referring to the feathers itself and like actual colors. But every bird has a fair amount of unique field marks. So like the American widgeon has that green, just a stripe on its head to a full green head. You'd have white at the top. You have that light colored bill with a black tip. If you were to give me those 3 lists, I would probably be able to tell you it's a widgeon. The mallard, everybody knows the mallard, but the field marks still, you have that pale yellow bill, full green head, white marking along the neck. Orange feet is a pretty solid field mark for a mallard. Again, this is just the male too. The female ducks tend to be far more drab and significantly harder to ID, especially at first compared to the males. So we're sticking with those just for simplicity's sake and because they have better field marks. The common golden eye, field mark A would be the golden eye. Also that white patch on the front of its face. Golden eyes tend to have a bit more of an iridescent green head. All of them are iridescent, but with like a golden eye in a lot of lightings, it just looks black with like green at the right thing. It's not like a mallard where like 95% of the time the head looks green. Common merganser, you would say for field marks, it had a fully green head. Listed field mark, especially with the common, because there's another species called a red-breasted merganser. To differentiate the two more easily, one of the common field marks you look for is that really clean line between where the green ends on the neck and the white begins on the rest of the body. Though, again, you could also point out the unique bill shape of the merganser. That's actually a serrated bill because they eat fish primarily. So they'll dive down in the water and actually just catch fish. And those, they're not true teeth, but like the points along the bill help to catch prey. The greater scaup, again, you have that paler bill, white on the sides, that iridescence on the head. The head, once again, typically appears more black most of the time, but if you catch it in the right lighting, it's green. The green-winged teal has plenty of field marks. It's pretty unique, but you would say something along the lines of the chestnut brown head, green stripe along the eye, bright green patch on the wing. And then the wood duck, red eye, nice dark brown all along the chest and breast, iridescent green along the head, crested head, and that really bright bill. So really goes to show the more field marks you can collect and sort of go like that mental checklist in your mind, like, oh, what notable features am I seeing? It makes ID a lot easier. So now let's get into some of the species that you can find in Ohio over the winter. Most of these are not terribly hard to find on your own, though I will talk about eBird a little bit more later on, which is a great online service that is totally free, and you could actually look for like individual species if you wanted. But some of our more common ones you might see in the top left, we've got a redhead, really handsome duck. There's another species that occurs here called a canvasback that looks fairly similar, but the head shape's a bit different. The bottom left, you've got a ringneck duck. Possibly, aside from like mallards, I would say ringnecks tend to be my most commonly seen species in the winter. You'll see really large groups of them on larger lakes and whatnot, which is called a raft. And you can find dozens, if not hundreds of these in one spot, especially along Lake Erie. There's So many ringneck ducks. Yeah, one more coming in. Top right, bufflehead, really cool duck. It's the smallest diving duck in North America. They have that really nice iridescence, at least for the male, and they're super tiny, which doesn't help with the fact that they're divers. So you might see it for a second, go to adjust your binoculars, and it's just gone. Um, but they're really cool. They're fairly common along winter or in the winter, and I find them from in water bodies as large as big reservoirs to there were this past winter on my commute into work, there was a pretty small pond in somebody's backyard that there was a bufflehead hanging out on for like a week. So they'll pick all if it's standing water, they'll it's fair game for a duck to at least sit in for a little bit. And then the trumpeter swan down in the top or bottom right, really cool species. Their population plummeted within the past 100 years or so, but they're on the upswing right now, which is great. Becoming increasingly common in this area. I know a few spots off the top of my head that are reliable trumpeter swan locations. Hiram Field Station, which I'll talk about a bit later when we go over some of my favorite local spots, always has a pair on it. Aurora Wetlands, I was just there like 2.5 weeks ago. It had 3 sitting on it. Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge gets hundreds of trumpeter swans, and they are just massive birds. They are the heaviest flying bird in North America. I think it's heaviest, not largest wingspan. I think it's heaviest. They're massive, and if you hear them vocalize, you will quickly understand why they got the name trumpeter swan. So they're very cool. There we go. Some raptors. Winter's a really good time to find raptors just because once again those leaves are gone. So a much larger bird hanging out in a tree becomes quite a bit more conspicuous. So bald eagles stay here all year. When lakes freeze over is actually a really great time to go look for eagles because they'll hang out on the ice. Barred owls, which again are here year round, but their breeding season is actually about to kick off either in like late December or early January. The same is true with great horned owls and with bald eagles, actually. So eagles will start nesting and will have eggs in the nest in February in some spots. So barred owls are a bit easier to find, at least in my experience, in the wintertime. They tend to be more active during the day too, which is nice. So they are a fairly easy owl to find compared to other owls. At least it still can be quite a challenge at times. And then on the right, we have the red-shouldered hawk. A bit smaller than the red-tailed hawk, which is the one you almost always see when like you're driving down the interstate and you're seeing hawks sitting along trees or things like that. Red shoulders are cool because if one posts up in like a park or something, they tend to get pretty used to people. So a more, for lack of a better term, a more wild red-shouldered hawk is easy to flush, but if it's something that's hanging out in a metro park most days, they'll let you get fairly close. And when you're birding, you shouldn't try to get as close as possible, especially to raptors and things like that. I mean, it's important to respect an animal's distance. Just, but you know, if you're walking a trail and it's sitting by the trail, like it's not really your fault if you flushed it per se. But I've had red-shouldered hawks let me walk under them from just due to necessity of me having to keep walking. So they can actually grow quite a tolerance to people. Woodpeckers. Most of our woodpeckers are here year round. The yellow-bellied sapsucker being the exception to that, where they are more migratory. Wintertime is great because you can find all 7 species, though again, the sapsucker, which I don't have pictured here, is going to be a bit harder to find. This is kind of like with the raptors and with most of them, great time to look for woodpeckers because they are staying in the trees for the most part. So when the leaves are gone, you can really easily follow them as they go up the trunk. On the left there, we have the northern flicker, which is a bit unique among our woodpeckers in that it prefers to, or it actually forages along the ground instead of along trees. Flickers primarily eat ants. So they look for nests and stuff or colonies along the ground. So you'll usually be flushing them. You'll be walking along, and then out of nowhere, this little brown blob just shoots up off the ground. And that was probably a flicker. And then on the right, my favorite woodpecker, the red-headed woodpecker, just stunning bird. Those nice clean black and white distinctions, and then that super bright red head. Those tend not to be super hard to find. They're kind of unique among our woodpeckers in Ohio, whereas they will form somewhat larger groups than you would normally see with the other woodpeckers, which are typically either solitary or will occur in like a mating pair. Red-headed woodpeckers are pretty easy to find in groups of like 5 to 6. I mean, I've been in the woods when I had a dozen hanging out around me. So usually if you found one red-headed woodpecker, you've probably found at least 3 or 4. And I mean, the more the merrier, because they are just very handsome birds. So can't talk about winter birding without talking about what are called foraging flocks, or as we'll call it, chickadee and friends. So this really interesting phenomena happens in the wintertime where you have multiple songbird species that are typically competing for the same food and resources that will actually form these big flocks together, and they will move through the forest over the wintertime. And the idea behind that is when you have more birds in a group, you know, it's great for us when the leaves are gone and whatnot, and there's less cover because we can see birds, but it's also great for the predators who suddenly have a better line of sight as well. How do you combat that? More pairs of eyes to look out for stuff. Wintertime, also, you have less food available usually. How do you combat less food? More birds to look for food. So they kind of, in a sense, settle their differences. They call a truce for the wintertime, and they all group together. And the ringleader is always either the black-capped chickadee in the more northern portions of the United States, or the Carolina chickadee in the southern portions. This is a black-capped chickadee on the left. Then next to that, to the right, is the golden-crowned kinglet. To the right of that, the tufted titmouse, very common feeder bird. And then to the right of that, the white-breasted nuthatch. But you will see these 4 species. You'll see downy woodpeckers with them. I've seen cardinals with them sometimes. You'll see every once in a while, I see like a sparrow known as the dark-eyed junco hanging with them. There's a really tiny species called the brown creeper, which I don't have any pictures of because they are an absolute nightmare to photograph, but they're super small, perfectly camouflaged, and they will kind of like the nuthatch, they'll move up and down the bark, typically up, but they'll hang out. So you could have like 7 to 8 species in one little foraging flock. And I mean, you could just be walking through the woods in the dead of morning. It's perfectly quiet, and then just an explosion of birds just lands on you out of nowhere, and they'll just do their thing. You might have them for 10 to 15 minutes. You might have them for 2 minutes, and then they're gone, and you're just left there wondering what just happened. Like, where'd everybody go? So they are just constantly on the move. I will take a second. The golden crowned kinglet is my favorite bird that occurs here in the winter. It's only here in the winter. They will migrate back north up to Canada and the more northern reaches of the United States in the summertime to breed. But they are down here during the cold months, and these are unbelievably tough birds for their size. So that it's I think it's in the top 5 at least for lightest songbirds. It weighs about as much as a dime, and they can tough it out in negative-degree weather. Really resilient birds. They're super tiny, utter nightmare to even look at in the binoculars. They do not sit still. I gave them the nickname, or I give them the nickname winter warblers. Anybody that's ever done any birding and knows about the warblers, one of their biggest traits is the fact that they do not sit still because they're constantly on the move looking for insects. The same is true for the kinglets. They aren't related to warblers at all, but they act just the same. They're super tiny, never slow down. So, I mean, in the time it takes for you to see one and bring your binoculars up to your eyes, it can be gone. Like 80% of the time, just you shouldn't have bothered like bringing the binoculars up. You weren't going to see it. But when you do get one that hangs out a bit and is a bit more relaxed, they are really cool birds to look at. And they're also pretty tolerant of people. I mean, in that picture, I couldn't have been more than 5, 6 feet away from it. So they're pretty cool with people, and they're amazing birds. They're arguably our toughest winter bird, in my opinion. And yeah, I have that up there. Chickadees are snitches, and not only in the sense that they are usually the ones that are sounding the alarm call to the rest of the group if they see a predator. They'll actually, so a lot of people know like the chickadee song, like chickadee, chickadee. Um, there's some evidence that they'll actually add D's to the end of their call when they see a predator. So if you hear like chickadee, dee, 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 he probably saw something and he's letting the rest of the group know, hey, like we need to get out of here. On the flip side, because chickadees are always vocalizing in the wintertime, if I want to find any of these other species that occur in these foraging flocks, I just listen for chickadees. Because if you find a chickadee in the wintertime, you probably found 5 or 6 other species at least. So it's not always bad to be a snitch. Wrens, another awesome group of songbirds. We primarily have 2 species in Ohio. On the left, we have the Carolina wren. On the right is the winter wren, which, as the name suggests, is usually only here in the wintertime. Carolina wrens are here year round. They are one of our most vocal songbirds, or just birds in general, in Ohio. I think there was one captive individual that was recorded singing 3,000 times in one day. They do not shut up. Uh, like vehemently vocalizing to mark out their territory and whatnot. They have a ton of attitude. They're super easy to find, or at least like get close to, in the sense of like their general area, because they're always vocalizing. Though they are fairly shy, so they'll stick to the underbrush typically for a while. But if you do find one that has found a nice singing perch, they usually will be a bit more tolerant of people to get a bit close when they're in the middle of singing. Really cool birds. They're I think our largest wren in Ohio. They have that really nice chestnut coloration. They're a bit easier to ID, like on the fly, as opposed to our other wrens. And then the winter wren on the right tends to be a bit harder to find, at least for me. I think I've seen it most too. So very secretive. They blend in a little bit better, and they're a little smaller than the Carolina wren, but they can be found throughout the state in the wintertime. So here's a good Scrabble word for you. Our frugivores, which is just a fancy way of saying our fruit eaters. Feel free to bust out the word frugivore the next party you're out. See if they kick you out or not. But no, so some of our species will switch their diets entirely to fruit in the wintertime. So the big 3 that are easiest to find that do this, you've got the cedar waxwing on the left, and down, everybody knows the American robin on the bottom, and the eastern bluebird in the top right. I found that a lot of people don't actually know that American robins will stay here year round. A lot of, and I mean, some of them will migrate and go south, but a lot of them hang out here. They just become a bit more secretive because they're not singing and they're just busy looking for fruit. But it's kind of funny that sometimes they are associated with the beginning of spring when they've been here all year doing the same thing. The same is true with bluebirds. They're here all year. In my experience, they tend to shift habitat. So when if you've ever been to a park with like bluebird boxes and whatnot, they're usually like on the edge of large open fields. In the wintertime, I tend to personally find bluebirds more often in open forests. They'll still go into fields and whatnot, but they're usually primarily looking for like fruit trees if they can. And eastern bluebirds are a lot more common than I think a lot of people realize. They kind of like the trumpeter swans we were talking about earlier. They had a pretty massive population decline which is where the bluebird boxes got their popularity because that was for the most part a successful conservation effort, and they bounced back. Though bluebirds are what is commonly referred to as a boom and bust species. So you'll see massive increases in population over a short period of time when times are good. And then if for some reason a major resource becomes more scarce, you have tons of bluebirds die in one year. So they fluctuate quite a bit, but there's usually a balance struck. Uh, and bluebirds, nice thing, some of our birds will get a bit duller with coloration when they're not in breeding season. The bluebirds will stay that super vibrant blue throughout the year if you can find a bright male. So he won't drop his colors at all, which is cool. And then cedar waxwings are like the poster child of fruit eaters in Ohio. They eat fruit year round, though in the summertime, you can actually see them picking off like dragonflies and whatnot, kind of acting like flycatchers. They'll take off from their perch, they'll catch something in the air. That's referred to as eating on the wing, actually. And then they'll come back and land and eat or whatnot, and they'll repeat the process. But they're doing fruit all year. We're a little past this time now, but usually in the fall, when the fledgling cedar waxwings start getting active, you can find really big groups of these birds in one spot. If you're lucky enough to be under a fruit tree or something, when they find you could have like 30 cedar waxwings land on you and just watch them do their thing. They're really cool. Some people might have heard of cedar waxwings getting drunk. That is a thing. If a fruit sits long enough, there's a chance it's going to ferment, and they're going to eat it regardless because they don't know any better. So they can actually intoxicate themselves. And you could see them like sort of swaying a bit or like laying on the ground basically because I mean they've got the spins. They had too much to drink, which it isn't great for the bird. I mean they're now incapable of escaping from predators most likely, but in a controlled environment, it's pretty amusing. So sparrows, one of the major groups we get in the wintertime. Sparrows are awesome. They have tons of variation in habitat use. Once you start to be able to differentiate the different species, because a lot of them do look very similar to one another, you can realize that you can have a lot of different sparrows in a small area. And this is by far not representative of all the different sparrows that occur in Ohio. But there are four, or at least two of the four, are pretty easy to find. So in the top left, we have the dark-eyed junco, one of my favorite winter birds. One of the easier sparrows to ID because they just have that nice slate gray coloration on the top half with the white belly. Interestingly, there's, I think, 3 or 4 different junco colorations you can run into, which are called morphs. So like over in the West Coast, the junco is more brown on the body and has a dark black head. And that's mostly reserved to that population of juncos. It's still the same species, but they look entirely different than the one on screen. But this one that's called the slate gray or the slate colored junco is the one we get primarily in Ohio. Top right, my hands down favorite sparrow. I love them when they come back every year, the white-throated sparrow. Again, this one has 2 morphs. Oh, I got a message in the chat. Or do I not? Oh, okay. Also, I know I'm gonna go for an hour and it's people's lunchtime. Has it already been an hour? Oh God, I gotta hurry. I'll answer this quick. If you have questions and need to leave, throw it in the chat and I'll answer as I go. What are the preferred fruit trees, bushes for winter birds? That's a good question. That I don't have a perfect answer to off the top of my head, but they're oh boy, I think elderberry they really like. Serviceberry, I think, is another good one. Most of our native berry producing bushes tend to be fair game. I think I've seen them on like cherry trees too. But there's quite a few you can plant. You can even look typically like at nurseries or like online spots. A lot of your berry producers will be listed as like bird friendly because that's things they like to browse on. Uh, Crap, I'm gonna go fast. All right, bottom left, we have a swamp sparrow, a little harder to find in the wintertime or just in general because they're a bit more secretive and they like wetland habitats. A very handsome bird. Bottom right, we have the eastern towhee, largest sparrow in Ohio. Um, that dark black head on the male is indistinguishable from any other sparrow. In females, the white on the belly and the brown on the flanks is the same, but they have a brown head instead of black. Towhees are ground foragers. They're not super common in the winter, but you absolutely can still find them. But they're a bit more popular in the spring and summer. They also have one of the easiest songs to identify for beginner birders. The with the mnemonic device being "Drink Your Tea." Very easy to learn. They're really cool birds. Real quick, I'm going to go over some rarities. Now, I know this is geared a bit more towards beginner birds, but just to show you the realm of possibilities, some of the harder to find species that do occur in Ohio. On the top left, we have a pine siskin. These are birds that experience what we call eruptive years, where they will only migrate down this far south on occasion. Typically, it's dependent upon how well their food crop up north does. So if it's a bad year for the things they typically like to eat, they will come further south for food. Whereas if, and I can't for the life of me right now remember what plant that is, but if a lot of it gets produced over the summer and into the fall, they'll actually stay north. So there'll be years where a couple pine siskins pop up in Ohio. There'll be years where a couple thousand pine siskins pop up in Ohio. Really just depends on food availability. In the top right, the northern shrike, pretty big on my list of birds that I'm actively attempting to find right now. I've never actually seen one. About the size of a robin. They have the nickname the butcher bird, which is pretty metal. They will take prey and impale it on thorns or barbed wire is a popular one now, and they'll leave it for later. So if you walk by like a barbed wire fence or something and see a bunch of grasshoppers just impaled, like you probably found a shrike. Uh, pretty merciless birds, but they're really cool. Fairly hard to find in Ohio too, even in the wintertime. So they are primarily here in the winter and uh, not a ton tend to pop up. In the bottom left, evening grosbeak, really, really big finch with that fantastic coloration. They're really funny when they pop up at a feeder because they like dwarf almost all the other birds that are eating, except for like the blue jays. They're huge. They'll come down occasionally into Ohio in flocks. So you usually will see them in groups of several individuals, but again, uh, not consistent from year to year and pretty rare in general. And then the long-tailed duck in the bottom right, you will usually get a couple per year. These are primarily sea ducks, but they'll hang out in Lake Erie sometimes in the winter, and then just by default, occasionally will pop up in larger water bodies. So I'm trying to think. Shenango Reservoir, I think, is the closest inland lake that I've seen one. That's over on Western PA. But like Mosquito Lake, which is nearby, probably like Mogador Reservoir or anything like that, like larger lakes have the potential to get a long-tailed duck. And that honestly, which is this is crazy because that's already a pretty good-looking duck. That's its non-breeding plumage for the male. The entire head actually shifts to black when they're breeding, which I didn't even know until I was putting this presentation together. I always just assumed uh, that's what the breeding males look like because I mean that's already a pretty crazy plumage. They're a really cool bird. It's harder to find. Real quick, some spots that I personally really enjoy birding at in the area. My favorite, Howard Marsh Metro Park up in Curtis, Ohio. That's along Lake Erie. It's a Toledo Metro Park. Gets a lot of rarities, and it's just a really good looking park in general. Some really great shorebird habitat up there. Mosquito Lake Park is where quite a few of the pictures in this slideshow were taken. It gets a lot of good waterfowl, shorebirds, things like that. It's fairly accessible. In the wintertime, the campground you can go in for free, and I see a lot of really cool birds in there. Uh, Aurora, Ohio has some really good parks you can check out that I get some good sightings at. Of course, Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge is one of the best spots in the country to go birding. Black Swamp Bird Observatory, which is right down the street from Ottawa, is arguably the best spot in the country to go birding, depending on what you're looking for. It's uh, often called the warbler capital of the world because you will get the vast majority of warbler species that migrate through the United States there in unbelievable numbers. It is the site of the biggest day in birding every year, usually the second week of May, where you'll get like over 1,000 people in one little spot going along the boardwalk to find warblers because you will see just so many good birds there. Mentor Lagoons up in Mentor, fantastic spot. You get some rarities up there. Trail Lake Park in Streetsboro is one I just recently found, but it's a really nice walk. Has a good lake on it. You'll see good forest and field habitat too, so the potential for a lot of different species. Morgan Park in Ravenna is a fantastic spot. Lake Newport, part of Mill Creek Metro Parks in Youngstown, gets really good rarities in ducks. And my local haunt right now is the James H. Barrow Biological Field Station in Hiram. It is associated with Hiram College and has a very large diversity of habitats. And you can find a ton of different species there if you're lucky. But that's just where I go. This map is actually taken from eBird. All those little blips are different birding hotspots where people somewhat regularly to frequently post checklists of the birds they found. So up in Cleveland, you see those dark oranges and reds. That's showing you there's a lot of good birding to be done along the Lake Erie coast. But all around us with Twinsburg and Streetsboro, the general area for TCWP, we have quite a few hotspots around us too. And you can go to eBird and they have maps of the entire world, but with the US too, you can scroll into any part of the country and see where people tend to report stuff. So I ran a little over time. Before we get into questions, I did skip over some of our more like common winter birds like cardinals, blue jays, American goldfinch, great blue herons are fair game throughout the winter. And then up in the top left, that's the yellow-rumped warbler, which is the only warbler you can find regularly in the wintertime. So I didn't want to exclude these, but I also didn't want to give too much time to talk about them just because I'm assuming most people are at least a little familiar with at least the blue jay and the cardinal and goldfinch. But does anybody have any questions?
I have a question.
I can open chat.
Do you you mentioned that you want to see a the bird, I forgot what their name is. The bird that likes
Northern shrike.
Yeah, the shrike. What's another bird that you'd really like to see but you haven't seen yet? Like, is there one that's at the top of your list or
Oh, yeah. The list is pretty high actually. So I'm going to Sedona in December and for a week, and the only bird that I'm specifically allowing to alter my plans there is something called the American dipper. It is the only aquatic songbird in the United States, which means like they will actively jump underwater while they're foraging. So you'll find them along streams out west, just hanging out in the rocks and like riffles and stuff of streams. And they're just doing their thing, like diving under the water and eating and coming back up. It's crazy. I'm desperate to see one. So my plan is to actively track one down while we're out there. But that's probably number one on my list. But I could talk all day. I mean, there's a little over. Oh man, what's the total count? There's several hundred more species that occur in the United States as opposed to that just 450 number from Ohio. I mean, once you go, because of like glaciation back in the ice ages and whatnot, a lot of our birds have a hard cutoff at the Mississippi River. So once you get across there, I mean, your backyard birds for the most part completely change. And that's just the common ones. I mean, there's all sorts of rarities and stuff, especially when you get up into the mountains or in the deserts. The West Coast gets different stuff like albatrosses and whatnot. So there are hundreds of birds that occur commonly in the United States that I haven't even seen yet, just because they don't occur here. But yeah, I would American Dipper is easily my number one.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Matt, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. I think everybody learned a little something. And we all are going to go outside this weekend and try to find some birds.
It
I
could
did.
have been a lot longer.
I know, right? Yeah. 450 is a lot of birds.
Yeah.
I posted in the chat the link to our YouTube. So this will go up on our YouTube page and you'll be able to go and find it or share it later. And then I also posted, Matt's doing a very small group hike tomorrow morning in Hudson, and there's a few spots still available. So if anybody is interested in signing up, there's a small window you can do so.
Yeah. Come along.
Yeah.
I will say I invited half the people left in this chat to this talk, so they don't, you guys don't necessarily need to register.
Yeah, or just show up.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys very much. I hope everybody at least learned something or enjoyed it. Birds are awesome. They really are. You could spend your whole life learning more and more about them. They're just so complex and diverse as a group of organisms.
Definitely.
Yeah. All right. Well, with that, that's it for me. So yeah, thank you guys again.
All right. Take care. Thanks. Bye, everybody.